The crate came ashore at Lunga Point in the last days of December 1942, wedged between cases of ammunition and cartons of quinine, and somebody back in the States had stenciled the word fragile across the lid in black paint. Nothing on Guadalcanal was fragile by then. The island had been chewing men for 5 months. The Marines who held Henderson Field were yellow with atabrine and hollow from dysentery, and the Army division sent to relieve them was already learning what the mud did to boot leather and what the rain did to a man's feet inside it. So when a supply sergeant dropped that crate at the feet of a second lieutenant from Illinois and read the stencil out loud, the men standing around him laughed. Inside was a Winchester Model 70, chambered in .30 to 06, fitted with a Lyman Alaskan scope on a Griffin and Howe side mount. A hunting rifle. A rich man's rifle, except the man who owned it was not rich. He had paid for it in installments out of National Guard drill pay, a few dollars at a time, over the better part of 2 years, because he had decided while still a civilian that when the war came for him, he would rather bring his own tools than trust the ones handed out at the armory. His name was John George. He was in his 20s, a competition shooter who had been winning matches in Illinois since he was old enough to hold a rifle steady, and by the standards of the National Rifle Association, he was among the best marksmen in the state. By the standards of the 132nd Infantry Regiment, he was the lieutenant with the mail order sweetheart. That was the phrase that stuck. Other officers called it his catalog gun. His company commander called it a toy, and told him to leave it in the tent and carry something a soldier would recognize. There was a logic behind the mockery, and it is worth understanding, because it was not stupidity. The M1 Garand was the best infantry rifle in the world in 1942. 8 rounds, semi-automatic, a soldier could empty it in seconds and reload without taking his eye off the target. George's Winchester held 5 and required him to work a bolt between every shot. In a jungle firefight at 30 feet, which is what most Pacific combat actually was, the Garand would win that argument every single time, and the men who said so were right. What they had not accounted for was that the fighting west of Henderson Field was about to stop being a firefight at 30 feet. The 132nd had come into the line in December, part of the Americal Division, taking over from Marines who had been fighting since August and were finished. The Army's first job was Mount Austin, a lump of jungle-covered high ground that the maps made look like a hill and the ground made feel like a mountain. The Japanese had built a horseshoe of bunkers into its western slope, connected by trenches, cut into the roots of trees, roofed with logs and earth, so that mortar rounds burst harmlessly overhead. They called that position the Gifu. Taking it cost the regiment weeks it had not planned to spend and men it could not replace. Rifle companies went in at full strength and came out looking like reinforced platoons. By the time the last bunkers fell in January, George had not fired his Winchester in combat once. Then his battalion moved down toward the coast, into the coconut plantations and the tangled second growth west of Point Cruz, and the war changed shape on him. There were no bunkers there, no line to attack, no objective on a map you could put a circle around. What there was, spread through the plantations and the old growth behind them, were Japanese soldiers who had been pushed west from Henderson Field and had gone up into the trees. Some of them were trained marksmen with scoped Arisakas. Most of them were ordinary riflemen who had figured out that a man in a banyan tree with a length of rope and a little patience could kill Americans all day. They tied themselves into the crotches of the big trees before first light. They wore vegetation. They did not fire at the first man in a patrol or the second. They waited for the officer, the radio man, the corpsman with the bag, the man who stopped to fill a canteen. The dying started in the 3rd week of January, and it did not come in battles. It came one at a time. A corporal knelt at a creek with 2 canteens in his hands and went face down into the water with a hole under his collarbone. A patrol from Elk Company took 2 men in 90 seconds from a tree they had already walked past twice that morning. A runner carrying a message 400 yards between command posts, on a trail the battalion used a dozen times a day, was found by the men who came looking for him with his message still in his fist. In 72 hours the battalion lost more men to snipers than it had lost in the previous week to everything else, and none of the dead had seen who killed them. That is a particular kind of casualty. It does something to a unit that a straight fight does not. Men stopped walking upright. They stopped bunching up, then stopped moving at all except when ordered, then started looking at every tree within 300 yards on every side of every trail, which is thousands of trees, which is impossible, which is the point. Officers took the bars off their collars. The battalion tried the obvious answers first, because that is what units do. They hosed the canopy with machine gun fire. They walked mortar rounds through the plantation. They burned through ammunition that had to be carried in by hand from the beach, and they killed leaves. The snipers kept shooting. On the evening of the 21st, the battalion commander sent for the lieutenant with the catalog gun. There is no transcript of that conversation, and George, who wrote about most things, wrote very little about this one. What we know is the shape of it. An officer who had spent 6 weeks treating a hunting rifle as a joke was now asking whether the joke could shoot, and the man holding it had to answer without sounding like he was selling something. George told him what he was: state champion. Regular groups on the 1,000-yard line at Camp Perry with iron sights, back when that meant something. 5 shots into 4 inches at 300 yards with the Alaskan glass on top, from prone, on a good day, with ammunition he had loaded himself. The commander said, "Prove it." So the next morning, in front of a fair number of men who had come to watch a lieutenant embarrass himself, somebody set a discarded Japanese helmet on a stake out past the edge of the perimeter, and somebody else paced off the distance, and George lay down in the mud and put the crosshairs on it and killed it 3 times in a row. The men who had walked out to look came back quiet. It is a small thing. It converted nobody's opinion about tactics. But it bought him permission, and permission was all he wanted. He went out before dawn on January 22nd. He took no spotter, which was against every doctrine that would later be written about this work, and he knew it, and he did it anyway, because there was no one trained to spot for him, and a second man moving through wet vegetation doubles your noise. He carried the Winchester, a canteen, 60 rounds in stripper clips, and nothing else that could rattle. He settled into the wreckage of a Japanese bunker his own battalion had taken 3 days earlier, which was the last place a sniper was supposed to sit, because obvious positions get shot at. He gambled that being obvious was the same as being invisible, since nobody expects to find a hunter in the ruins the infantry has already picked over. Then he began to look at trees, and this is the part of the story that gets skipped, because it is not exciting and it is the entire skill. The Lyman Alaskan magnified 2.5 times. 2.5. That is barely more than a good pair of reading glasses. It gathers a little light, it flattens the shadows out slightly, and it will not show you a man. What it shows you is that something in a patch of green is a slightly different green than the green beside it. George glassed the plantation the way a man reads a page, left to right and down, one branch at a time, and then did it again and again. Sweat ran into his eyes. Ants found him inside the first hour and stayed. Flies worked at the edges of his mouth. Somewhere off toward the ridges, the artillery kept up its irregular conversation with itself, and the birds started and stopped for no reason he could ever tie to anything. He had been in position better than 2 hours before a branch moved 80-odd feet up a banyan, roughly 240 yards out, on a morning with no wind to move it. He did not shoot. He watched. That is what separates the ones who last from the ones who don't. He watched until the shape resolved, until the green became a shoulder and a head, and then a man sitting in the fork where 3 limbs came together, facing east, watching the supply trail where American working parties had been passing since first light. The Japanese soldier was doing exactly what George was doing, and he had been doing it longer, and he had no idea he had become the target instead of the shooter. George put in 2 clicks of correction, let his breath out to the natural pause, and broke the trigger the way he had broken it 10,000 times on ranges in Illinois. The rifle came back into his shoulder. 240 yards away, a man came out of a tree and fell for the better part of 90 feet through branches that turned him as he came, and hit the plantation floor, and did not move. George worked the bolt. The empty case flipped out into the mud of the bunker floor, and he chambered a fresh round without lifting his cheek off the stock, because Japanese snipers worked in pairs, and the second man was already looking for him. He found him at 40-odd minutes past 9. Different tree, 60 yards north of the first, considerably lower, and moving. The man had heard the shot, understood what it meant, and was coming down the trunk to get out of the area, which was correct and also fatal, because a man climbing down a tree is a man who cannot stop and cannot hide. George led him the way you lead anything moving, and fired, and the second sniper came off the trunk backward with his rifle falling ahead of him through the leaves. 2 shots. 2 men. Before 10 o'clock in the morning, he reloaded from a stripper clip and made himself lie still, and later he would write about that stillness in the flat way he wrote about everything, as though it were a technical specification rather than a description of what it takes to lie in a hole in the ground after killing 2 people and keep your hands steady. His hands were steady. He noted it. He noted it the way a man notes the weather. Around midday, a Japanese bullet hit the sandbag beside his head and threw grit into his face. That shot came from the southwest, from a direction he had not been watching, and it told him 2 things. In the half-second it took him to roll off the firing position and put his back against the bunker wall. It told him he had been located. It also told him the man who located him was good, but not perfect, because a perfect shot would have ended the argument. He waited. He waited long enough that most men would have decided the danger had passed, and long enough that most men would have moved, and both of those men die. Doctrine says, shoot and relocate. But doctrine assumes you have somewhere to go, and in that plantation, a man tied into a tree 80 feet up cannot simply climb down and stroll to a better one in daylight with an American scope hunting him. So George bet that the third sniper had shifted branches instead of trees. He was right. It took him 17 minutes of glassing to find the man in the third tree of a cluster, high, sitting in shadow with vines pulled around him. George did not rush the shot. He put the crosshairs on the dark shape and squeezed, and the man came apart from the tree without a sound. By the time the light went out of the plantation that evening, he had accounted for 5. Word went back up the trail ahead of him, the way word does. Men who had spent 6 weeks calling his rifle a catalog gun now wanted to come out and watch him work, and a few of them asked directly. He told them no. He was not being dramatic about it. Spectators move, movement draws eyes, eyes draw fire, and every man who came out to see the show made the show more likely to kill somebody. He went back to the battalion area, cleaned his rifle, ate something out of a can, and slept badly. The second day started under rain, the kind of tropical downpour that turns the ground to soup and shortens the world to 100 yards. He sat in his hole for 3 hours and watched water run off the edge of the sandbags and could not have hit a barn. The rain also gave the Japanese a gift, and they took it. When it slacked off after 8 and the plantation came back into view, there was a man in a tree who had not been in that tree the evening before, roughly 290 yards out, considerably farther than anything George had shot at the day before. That was not an accident. They had watched their own men die and worked out the practical limit of whatever the American was carrying, and had decided to stand outside it. George shot him at 290 yards. That was the 6th, and it produced a response that told him precisely how seriously he was now being taken. Within the hour, Japanese mortars began walking rounds toward his position. The first salvo landed short. The second landed shorter, which meant somebody with a working knowledge of adjusting fire had eyes on the ground and was correcting. George did not wait for the third. He grabbed the rifle and his ammunition and ran north along the tree line and threw himself into a shell crater, and the bunker he had been lying in for 2 days came apart behind him in a spray of sandbags and log splinters and old Japanese timber. He lay in the crater with his face in the mud and understood that the arrangement had changed. For a day and a half he had been a hunter working a woodlot. Now he was one half of something with 2 ends, and the other end was thinking about him with the same care he was giving to it. He moved 120 yards north to a fallen tree and started over. He killed his 7th that afternoon. He killed his eighth near sundown, high in a banyan, a man who had chosen elevation over concealment, and got away with it until the sun swung far enough west to draw him in outline against the sky. That night he did his arithmetic. The battalion's best guess, assembled from bodies and directions of fire and the few prisoners anyone had taken, was that 11 Japanese marksmen had been operating in that stretch of plantation. 8 were dead. That left 3, and the 3 that were left were the 3 who had watched the others die, which meant they were the careful ones. They knew his approximate ground. They knew the sound his rifle made, which was not the sound of a Garand and carried differently. They knew that the American only ever fired once. George cleaned the Winchester, loaded 5 fresh rounds, and lay down. He gave up on sleeping around 3 in the morning and sat in the dark with the rifle across his knees until the rain came back. He did not go to the fallen tree at dawn. He went 70 yards south of it, to a cluster of rocks the Marines had used as a machine gun nest back in the fall. And he got there in the rain, because rain covers movement and covers it for both sides. The rain thinned toward mid-morning, and within the hour, he found a man in a palm tree. The position was wrong. He knew it was wrong before he could have told you why. It was low, maybe 40 feet, when every other man he had killed had been high. It was in a palm rather than a banyan, and palm fronds hide you beautifully from the ground and not at all from anything above you. And George was above it, up on the rocks, looking down into the crown at a set of shoulders and the back of a head as clearly as if the man had been standing in an open field. 3 days earlier, he would have taken that shot and been proud of it. He lowered the rifle instead. Because the 3 men left in that plantation had watched 8 of their friends die of small mistakes, and there was no reason on earth for one of them to make the largest one available. Which meant the man in the palm tree was not a mistake. He was an invitation. Somewhere out there was a second rifle laid on that palm, waiting for the muzzle flash of whoever accepted it. So George did the hardest thing in this entire story, which was nothing. He left a killable man alive in his scope and went looking for the one he could not see. Left to right, top to bottom, every tree within 300 yards. It took 11 minutes, and 11 minutes is a very long time to lie still, knowing that somewhere a man is doing to you exactly what you are doing to him. He found him 80 yards northwest of the palm, 90-odd feet up a banyan, screened on 3 sides by vines, with a clean line of sight onto the fallen tree where George had been lying the day before. Not onto the rocks, onto yesterday's position. The Overwatch had set his ambush on the assumption that the American would return to ground he had used before, and he had been waiting there since before first light for a man who had already outsmarted him without knowing it. Now George had a problem with 2 bad answers. If he shot the man in the banyan, the report would tell the man in the palm exactly where he was, and by the time the bolt came back and forward, there would be a rifle coming around onto him. If he did nothing, the Overwatch would eventually work out that yesterday's position was empty and begin searching, and there were only so many places on that slope to be. He took the third answer, and it is the coldest decision in this story. He shot the bait. He put the crosshairs on the man in the palm tree, the one he had already decided was a decoy, and killed him. Then he swung the rifle to the banyan before the sound had finished moving through the plantation, because he knew exactly what the second man would do. A man in a hide turns toward a shot. It is reflex, and it takes about a second, and it is the only second in which a man who has been motionless since 4 in the morning becomes visible. George caught the movement, put the crosshairs where the movement was going, and fired before the turn finished. Both of them came out of the trees inside 20 seconds of each other. 10. And then the plantation opened up on him, because 2 shots from one place is an address. He was up and running before the second body landed, east along the rocks and down into a drainage ditch 40 yards away, and he pressed his face into the mud while Japanese machine gun fire took the rocks apart above him. He had been lying there 6 seconds earlier. When it stopped, he counted a full minute before he let himself move, and then he crawled another 100 yards east and slid into a shell crater half full of rainwater and settled down into it with the water at his chest and the Winchester resting on the rim. One left. He glassed for 2 hours and found nothing, and the reason he found nothing was that he was looking in the wrong dimension. The 11th man was not in a tree. He was on the ground, and he was coming. George caught it at the edge of his vision, 60 yards south, so low and so slow that it read as vegetation for several seconds before it read as a man. The last sniper was crawling. He was using the fern and the deadfall the way his friends had used the canopy, and he was working his way toward the rocks, toward the muzzle flash that had killed the other two, hunting the American the way the American had been hunting them. George stayed exactly where he was, in the water, and did not shoot, because the crater rim blocked the angle, and getting the angle meant rising up, and rising up meant being seen. So he waited, and the Japanese soldier came on, 40 yards, 35, 30, stopping to look, moving again. He was approaching from the south, along the line George had used to break contact under the machine gun. That was not luck. That man had watched the whole thing and reasoned his way to it. At around 3 minutes past 10, the last sniper reached the rocks, climbed into the old Marine machine gun nest, and settled in facing east, toward the drainage ditch, toward where the American should have been. His back was to a crater 38 yards away with a rifle in it. An easy shot. Iron sights would have done it. And George hesitated a second time, for the same reason as before, because a man who had outlived 10 others does not park himself in the most obvious cover on the hillside and turn his back on half the compass. He held the crosshairs on that back and made himself look at everything else, and 70 yards northwest, behind a fallen trunk, he found the other one. Not moving, not repositioning, just watching, with his rifle already laid on the ditch. 2 of them. The last 2 had come out together and had built the same trap George had walked around 3 days running, and this time they had built it properly, with a live man as bait instead of a corpse. He could not take both. That was the arithmetic, and there was no argument with it. A bolt gun gives you 1 shot, and then a mechanical noise and a movement, and roughly a second and a half of being a target. And the man behind the fallen trunk was awake and aimed. So George did the only thing left, which was to disappear. He lowered himself into the water until nothing was above the surface but his eyes and the top of his head, held the Winchester upright to keep the barrel clear, and became part of a mud puddle in a plantation on an island in the Solomon Islands, and waited 10 minutes. Then the man in the rocks stood up. He had watched an empty ditch long enough to conclude the American had gone farther east, and he signaled to his partner, and the 2 of them came out of cover and began a sweep, 70 yards apart, moving east on either side of a water-filled shell crater. They passed him. Both of them passed within yards of a man they had spent 3 days trying to find, and put their backs to him, and kept walking. George came up out of the water slowly, with it running off the stock and off his face and out of his sleeves, and shot the nearer one at about 40 yards. He worked the bolt while the man was still falling. The second one had already begun to turn, was already bringing his rifle around, and George beat him to it by a margin nobody will ever be able to measure. 11 men in 4 days. 12 rounds fired. He should have gone home then. He stayed to police up his brass, which was a habit from competition shooting and probably from the Depression too, and that is when he heard the voices. Japanese voices out of the tree line, more than a few. Not snipers. Snipers do not talk. This was a working party or a patrol, coming out to collect the 2 men who had just fallen in the open, and they were close, and George had 3 rounds in the rifle, and his stripper clips were in a pack he had left near the rocks. He went back into the water. He lay there with the crater rim at eye level and listened to them find the first body, and heard the tone of the conversation change, and heard them move to the second. Then the voices started coming toward him, and he understood what he had missed. He had been meticulous about sound and movement and light for 4 days. He had not been meticulous about footprints, and there were footprints in wet mud running from the rocks to the crater, plain as a road sign. A Japanese soldier appeared on the rim and looked straight down at him, and for a fraction of a second, the 2 of them simply looked at each other, One man standing. One man submerged in brown water with only his face showing. George shot him from the water. He worked the bolt while he was still half under, came up, and put down two more at the crater's edge, before either of them fully registered what they were looking at. Then the rifle was empty, except for what was left, and men were shouting, and he went out over the north lip on his hands and knees, and ran 20 yards, and dropped behind a log while rifle fire cut the leaves apart around the crater he had just left. They were shooting at noise. He gave them none. He glanced under the log, saw two men moving up on the crater at 50 yards, and killed the lead one. The other went flat. Then he heard movement to the south as well, and understood he was about to be worked around from two sides by men with semi-automatic weapons, while he held a bolt-action rifle with almost nothing in it. So he ran. 90 seconds of flat sprinting through vine and undergrowth with branches taking the skin off his face and rounds cracking past him, and then a dry crater, and then silence, because they had not followed. They had gone back to their dead. He walked into the American perimeter a little after 11, and a sentry challenged him, and what came out of the plantation was a filthy, bleeding, shivering man, carrying a hunting rifle with mud in the action and 2 rounds left in it. The debrief was short, and mostly numbers, because George was constitutionally incapable of describing it any other way. 11 snipers, 12 rounds at snipers, 11 hits, 3 more men in the firefight afterward, plus 1 during the withdrawal, 5 rounds expended. Ammunition status, 2. Weapon status, functional, requires cleaning, water in the bore, and mud in the action. Somebody wrote it down. That is the whole official memory of 4 days that changed how an American division thought about a single rifleman. A few lines in a battalion journal, in pencil, in a tent, in the rain. And that is the thing that stays with me about this story. Almost everything you have just heard survives because one man happened to be a writer as well as a shooter. The men beside him were not. Their 4 days went into the same pencil summaries and then into a warehouse. If you have a grandfather or a great-uncle from that war and all you have left of him is a name, a photograph, and a box of objects nobody ever explained to you, that paper still exists and it can still be made to talk. I wrote a guide to doing exactly that, working backward from almost nothing until a service record takes shape. It is called Find Your Grandfather's War, and the link is in the description below. Because the pencil summary was not the end of it. 2 days after George came out of that plantation, the regimental commander sent for him with a question nobody in the American Army was really equipped to answer in 1943. Could this be taught? The United States had no sniper program worth the name at the start of the Pacific War. There was no school, no formal military occupational specialty, no doctrine that survived contact with a jungle. What the regiment did have was 14 Springfield rifles fitted with inertial target scopes, left behind by Marines who had gone off the island, and roughly 40 men in the regiment who had qualified expert on a rifle range in the States before anybody shot back at them. George said yes, with one condition. He wanted to keep his own rifle. The Springfields could go to the men he trained. The colonel approved it, and I suspect he found the request funny, which is fine. It was granted, and that is what matters. Training started at the end of January on a stretch of open ground a couple of miles from Henderson Field, and George found out immediately that expert qualification on a known distance range is nearly worthless as a predictor. His 40 men could all shoot. Most of them had never had to find a target before shooting it, which is the actual job. He started with the fundamentals, and then with the thing the fundamentals are for. Learning to look at 100 acres of vegetation and pick out the 1 square foot that is wrong. The Springfields with inertals ran around 11 pounds, heavier than a Garand and heavier than his Winchester. That weight makes a rifle steady and makes a man tired, and the jungle almost never gives you a comfortable place to lie down. He drilled them on building a position out of whatever was there. A root, a pack, a pair of sandbags, a log with a notch in it. He put them on stationary targets, then moving ones, then targets deliberately screened by brush, which is what they would actually be shooting at. He paired them off, shooter and spotter, and he insisted the roles rotate. The spotter carried binoculars and a Garand, and his job was to find targets and to cover the shooter, since a man looking through a 2.5 power scope has no idea what is happening around him. George had worked alone for 4 days and had nearly died twice because of it. He was not going to teach anybody else to do that. By the end of the month, about 32 of the 40 could put rounds into man-sized targets at 300 yards under field conditions. Not range conditions. Field conditions. Wet, hot, tired, in a hurry. He took 4 teams out on the 1st of February, west of the Matanikau, and set up on high ground over a trail the Japanese were still using to move supplies and men. The first target came onto the trail in the morning. The spotter confirmed him. George fired once. Over the next several hours, that one team accounted for most of a squad's worth of Japanese soldiers on a stretch of trail 400 yards long, and the other 3 teams came back with similar stories, and the day's total ran to more than 20 enemy dead against 0 American casualties. The section kept working through the first week of February, and by the 9th it had accounted for 74 confirmed, and the word confirmed there is doing real work. It meant somebody watched the man fall and stay down. The actual figure was certainly higher, and George refused to guess at it, which tells you most of what you need to know about him. It was also, by then, an army chasing an enemy that was leaving. Japanese destroyers were coming down at night to lift troops off the western tip of the island, and American units pushing west kept running into rearguards fighting the kind of fight that men fight when their only job is to buy time for somebody else's boat. George's teams were sent against exactly those rearguards. On the 7th of February, near the Tenaru, one of them got him first. The bullet went through his left shoulder and turned him around and put him on the ground, and his spotter dragged him into cover and yelled for a corpsman. It missed the bone and it missed the arteries, which is the difference between a story and a grave. They evacuated him to a field hospital near Henderson Field and cleaned it out and sewed it up and told him he was done for at least 3 weeks. 2 days later, the American division reached Cape Esperance and found it empty. The Japanese had taken off more than 10,000 men in a night operation the Americans did not detect until it was over. Guadalcanal was finished. George's sniper section had existed for less than 2 weeks. He was still in the hospital when the next thing found him. Somebody in the Pacific was assembling volunteers for an operation nobody would describe, somewhere in Asia, and the recruiting language was the sort designed to attract exactly one kind of officer. Long-range penetration. Jungle. Hazardous. George volunteered from a hospital cot with a hole in his shoulder. By spring, he was on a transport crossing the Indian Ocean with the Winchester in a case in the hold and the Lyman scope wrapped in oilcloth, on his way to India and to a unit that had no name yet. Officially, when the paperwork caught up, it was the 5307th Composite Unit, Provisional, which is a designation that tells you nothing and was probably meant to. The men called it something else. The press called it Merrill's Marauders, and that is the name that lasted. 3,000 volunteers, trained in central India through the back half of 1943, for a job the American Army had never done. Walk into Japanese-held Burma with no supply line, no road, no artillery, nothing but what men and mules could carry, and stay there, and keep moving, and cut the enemy up from behind, while the main effort came the other way. George prepared for it the way he prepared for everything, by taking his rifle apart and thinking about ounces. Guadalcanal had been a short-range campaign with a beach behind it. Burma was going to be hundreds of miles of mountain and river with 60 pounds on his back and no resupply he could count on. He pulled the Lyman off and put on a lighter Weaver of the same magnification, saving half a pound. He went to a lighter stock. He got the whole rifle down under 9 pounds, which sounds like fussing until you have carried an extra pound uphill for 3 months. The Marauders crossed into Burma in February of 1944, and what followed is one of the hardest marches any American unit made in that war. 80-odd miles in the first week through mountain jungle. Men fell out from heat and exhaustion. Mules broke legs on the descents and had to be shot, which meant their loads went on to men who were already carrying too much. By March, they had covered better than 200 miles and fought a dozen engagements, none of them battles, all of them ambush and skirmish and quick withdrawal, because a unit with no artillery and no resupply cannot afford to stand and fight anybody. And in 3 months of that, John George fired his Winchester in anger 7 times. 7. Once at a Japanese officer directing traffic at a river crossing, well past 400 yards. Once at a machine gun position. Once at a sniper who had a patrol pinned. Never twice in the same engagement, because his rifle's report was distinctive in a way a Garand's was not, and 1 shot announced him while 2 located him. He had learned that lesson on Guadalcanal from men who died of it. Most marauder combat was nothing a scoped rifle could help with. It was 30 feet in bamboo. It was a firefight that started and finished before anyone identified a target. It was disease, mostly, in the end. The unit lost far more men to malaria, dysentery, and typhus than to Japanese fire. They took the airfield at Myitkyina in May, which was the objective and which mattered, and by the time they took it, the unit was hollowed out and combat ineffective and had to be pulled apart. George came out of Burma in the summer of 1944 with the rest of them, and never fired that rifle at another human being. He also came out of it having worked something out that he was honest enough to write down later, even though it undercut his own legend. The Model 70 was, in his opinion, close to the finest bolt-action rifle a man could own, and the war was moving away from it. The future belonged to semi-automatic fire, to mass production and interchangeable parts, to units that could be equipped and trained on an industrial scale rather than assembled around one man's peculiar excellence. He understood why. He agreed with it, mostly. He also thought something real was being lost in the trade, and he did not pretend otherwise. The Army sent him home, promoted him, and put him to work at Fort Benning, teaching what he knew to infantry officers. The rifle went into a footlocker in his quarters. He did not look at it much. In 1947, he sat down to write, and the important thing about why he wrote is that it had nothing to do with glory. He wanted the technical detail on paper before it went out of his head. Which rifles worked in that climate, and which ones seized. What Japanese ammunition actually did. What 2.5 power gets you in a jungle, and what it does not. How far a man can really shoot when he is exhausted and wet and frightened, as opposed to how far he can shoot at Camp Perry in a clean shirt. It ran past 400 pages, and he wrote it for a file drawer. A friend at the National Rifle Association read it and told him it had to be published. George thought that was ridiculous. It was a book about ballistics and equipment with no romance in it whatsoever, and who exactly was going to read that? It came out in 1947 as Shots Fired in Anger, and it never went away. It is still in print. It is still cited by historians of small arms and by collectors of Japanese weapons, because George's descriptions of what he took off dead men and then took apart and tested are among the most careful first-hand accounts anybody produced. And the tone is the strangest thing about it. There is no swagger. He describes killing men the way he describes chamber pressures. When you go looking in it for the 4 days at Point Cruz, you find them reported almost in passing, in the flat voice of a man filing a report on equipment performance, which is precisely why people have trusted it for 80 years. He left the Army in 1947 and went to Princeton on the GI Bill and graduated with highest honors. Then Oxford, then 4 years in British East Africa, then Washington, where he ran an institute on African affairs, and later lectured and consulted for the State Department. He spent his working life on a continent and a set of problems that had nothing to do with the Solomon Islands, among colleagues who knew vaguely that he had been in the Pacific and knew nothing at all about a plantation west of Point Cruz. He died in 2009, an old man, in a country that had fought 4 more wars since his. He had lived long enough to watch the Garand give way to the M14 and the M14 to the M16, and to watch the United States finally build the sniper schools and the doctrine and the dedicated equipment that did not exist when a lieutenant had to improvise all 3 of them by himself in 4 days with a rifle he bought on installments. The Winchester went to a firearms museum in Virginia. It is in a case. It is a plain-looking pre-war sporting rifle with a small scope on a side mount, and there is a card beside it, and most people who walk past it are on their way to something shinier. I like that, actually. It is the right ending for this particular man, who never once in 400 pages suggested he had done anything remarkable. The rifle sits there looking exactly like 10,000 other deer rifles from the 1930s, and only the card tells you that a state champion from Illinois carried it into a plantation on Guadalcanal, where an entire battalion had failed for 2 weeks, and came out 4 days later having ended the problem, having been laughed at the whole way in. If this one got to you, take a second and hit like, because that is genuinely what decides whether the next forgotten man gets found. Subscribe if you want more of them. We go looking every week. And leave a comment telling me where you are watching from, and if there was somebody in your own family who served, put down his name. That is the point of all this. Somebody says the name out loud, and he is not gone.